The klaxon was already screaming when I shoved open the observatory door. Red light pulsed across the walls. Every Velthari scientist in the building was standing frozen, their 7 limbs locked in postures I had learned meant something between panic and grief. The main display above the central console showed a single line of text in their script, and even though I had only been studying their language for 3 weeks, I could read it well enough. Simulation failure. 4,997. I stood there in the doorway, 17 years old, still holding the protein bar I had grabbed from the diplomatic quarters, and I watched a room full of the oldest and most brilliant minds in the known galaxy do something I had never seen them do before. They sat down on the floor. All of them. Just lowered themselves, slowly, like the air had gone out of them. My name is Kara Ellison. My mother is Deputy Attaché Nina Ellison, one of 3 humans Earth sent to the Velthari home station to negotiate for access to interstellar gate technology. I was not supposed to come. My mother brought me because my father had just walked out on us, and she did not want to leave me alone in London for 8 months, and because she believed, deeply and truly, that dragging a teenager across the galaxy was going to be educational. She was right. She just had no idea what kind of education it would turn out to be. The Velthari are extraordinary beings. They live for thousands of years. They have 4 brains, each one processing different layers of thought simultaneously. Their civilization has been spacefaring for 40 millennia. They look at humans the way a professor might look at a very enthusiastic puppy, fondly, occasionally impressed by a trick, but never, ever expecting the puppy to sit down and correct the thesis. The problem they had been working on for 5,000 years was called the tesserine collapse. It worked like this. When you build an interstellar gate, you are essentially folding 2 points in space close enough to touch. The Velthari had the technology to do this at short range, for small masses, but every time they tried to scale the process up, to build gates massive enough for cargo ships, colony vessels, anything that would actually change the course of civilizations, the gate collapsed at a specific point in the construction sequence, every time, without exception. Across 5,000 years of attempts, across 47 generations of Velthari scientists, across 7 different mathematical frameworks and 3 entirely separate schools of physics, the collapse happened at exactly the same moment. They called that moment the boundary of the unsolvable. A philosopher named Vel Han, who was now 3,000 years old and sat on the High Council, had written a famous text declaring that the boundary proved the universe had a ceiling on what intelligence could achieve, that some doors were simply locked, that wisdom meant knowing which walls could not be moved. That text was considered among the most important philosophical works in Velthari history. I had read it the previous Tuesday afternoon because I was bored, and Ku Vel had left it open on his secondary screen. Ku Vel was the only Velthari who talked to me. He was 200 years old, which made him very young by their standards, barely past what they considered early adulthood. He had a dry sense of humor, a habit of clicking his upper 2 limbs together when he was thinking hard, and a complete inability to mask his expression when he found something stupid. He was the one who explained the tesserine collapse to me, on my 4th day at the station, in the tone of someone explaining calculus to a golden retriever. I had listened politely. I had asked a few questions. He had answered them with patience that was clearly costing him something. What I had not told him was that I had been obsessed with topology since I was 12. Topology is the mathematics of shapes and surfaces and connection. It is the study of how things fold, how they stretch, how they map onto each other, how a surface that looks flat in one framework looks completely different when you add more dimensions to your thinking. Most people find it abstract and strange. I found it beautiful. I had notebooks full of it back home. My maths teacher, a quiet woman named Mrs. Albright, had once told my mother that I thought in a way that was hard to categorize, that I did not solve problems so much as walk around them until I found a door everyone else had overlooked. She meant it as a compliment. My mother had not been entirely sure. Standing in that doorway, watching the greatest scientists in the galaxy sit down in defeat, I looked at the display showing simulation failure number 4,997, and I felt something very specific move through my chest. Not pride, not excitement, something quieter than both of those things. Recognition. I had seen this before. Not the exact problem, obviously, but the shape of it, the way the equations folded at the collapse point, the way the numbers ran perfectly until that one specific moment and then fell apart. I had seen that shape in my own notebooks. I had drawn it, in different terms, working through a topology problem about surface inversions in 6-dimensional space that my teacher had given me as an optional challenge when I was 15. The Velthari were thinking in 4 dimensions. They had always thought in 4 dimensions. Their entire mathematical tradition, 5,000 years of it, was built on 4-dimensional frameworks. You do not question the foundation. You learn from your elders, and your elders learn from their elders, and the foundation is the foundation. But the collapse point was not a wall. It was a fold. And when you folded a surface, you did not walk through the crease. You mapped around it by treating the problem as a surface inversion rather than a tunnel construction. You went sideways, into dimensions the Velthari framework had never needed to use. My hands were already moving before I had fully decided to move them. I walked into the room. No one stopped me, because no one noticed me. I sat down at the secondary console in the corner, the one Kuvel sometimes let me use to read through archived research when I was bored, and I pulled up the core equations of the tesserine collapse. I started writing. Not carefully, not nervously, the way I always wrote when the math was talking to me and I just had to keep up with it. My stylus moved fast, and the equations came out clean, and the framework I was using was not Velthari, and it was not the human physics that had been built on Velthari borrowings. It was pure topology, the branch that humans had developed independently over the past century, that the Velthari had never needed because their mathematical tradition had gone down a different road. The six-dimensional surface inversion framework took the collapse point and dissolved it, not bypassed it, dissolved it, showed that it was not a wall at all, but an artifact of trying to describe a six-dimensional phenomenon using four-dimensional language, like trying to describe a sphere by drawing a circle and insisting the circle was everything the sphere could ever be. I worked for about 25 minutes, maybe less. I sat back. I looked at the display showing 4,997 failures. I looked at my screen. I said, very quietly, to absolutely no one, "Oh." I ran the simulation. The gate held. I stared at my screen for a moment, then I ran it again, using different mass inputs. The gate held again. I ran it 7 more times, increasing the mass parameters each time, pushing them past every threshold where previous simulations had collapsed, and every single time the gate held solid and stable and permanent. My heart was beating in a very strange way. I heard footsteps behind me. Kuvel had come in for his early shift. He stopped when he saw me at the console, and he started to say something in Velthari that I was fairly certain translated to something like, "What are you doing at my station at this hour?" And then he saw the screen, and he stopped speaking. He stood very still. He looked at my equations for a long time. His upper limbs made a slow clicking motion that I had never seen before. Not the rapid click of concentrated thinking, but something slower, almost like gears catching. Then he ran the simulation himself. The gate held. He ran it again. It held. He ran it 4 more times, adjusting variables each time, and his movements became faster and less careful. Less like a scientist and more like a person who could not trust what they were seeing and kept checking, hoping to find the error. And every time the gate held and every time his movements got a little stranger. Finally he stopped. He turned to look at me. He had 4 visual organs and all 4 of them were focused on my face. "You are 17 years old," he said. "And 4 months," I said. "This framework," he gestured at the screen, "explain to me where it comes from." Topological surface theory. It is a branch of mathematics that humans have been developing for about 100 years. It came out of some work on dimensional mapping that a mathematician named Lina Vasquez started in the 2060s. I have been using it since I was about 12, for fun mostly. When I saw the collapse point in your equations, it looked exactly like a 6-dimensional fold problem I had worked through at school, so I applied the same framework and the collapse point just disappeared. Kuvel was quiet for a very long time. "You solved it," he said, "because it looked like something you had drawn in a notebook." "Yes." Another silence. "And you were not afraid to write it down?" I thought about that honestly. The math did not ask me how old I was, or what species I belonged to, I said, so I did not think those things were relevant. He made a sound I had never heard a Velthari make, low and short, and almost percussive. I did not know it then, but I learned later that it was the sound of genuine surprise, the kind that comes not from an unexpected event but from a moment when the world becomes briefly larger than you thought it was. Within 2 hours, every senior scientist on the station had been woken up and brought to the observatory. Within 4 hours, the High Council had been contacted. Within 6, Velhan himself, the 3,000-year-old philosopher who had declared the boundary of the unsolvable to be proof of the universe's fundamental limits, stepped off a transit pod and into the observatory, and stood in front of my equations on the screen for a very long time without speaking. My mother arrived in the middle of this. She had been pulled from sleep, and she stood at the back of the room in her diplomatic clothes thrown over her nightwear, and she looked at me with an expression I could not fully read. which was unusual because I had always been very good at reading my mother. I found out later it was the expression she made when she was trying very hard not to cry in public. The room was crowded and buzzing with that low Velthari clicking that meant many minds working simultaneously, and I sat in the corner on the floor because all the chairs were occupied, and I ate the rest of my protein bar, and I waited. Velhan turned to look at me eventually. He was ancient in a way that had a physical weight to it. 3,000 years of thought behind his eyes. He crossed the room slowly, and he looked down at me sitting on the floor, and I looked up at him, and neither of us said anything for a moment. "You are Nina Ellison's daughter," he said. "Yes." "How long did this take you?" "Maybe 20 minutes. I am not sure exactly." He was quiet again. Then he said, "We have a saying in Old Velthari. It does not translate perfectly, but roughly it means, the longer you polish the same lens, the harder it becomes to imagine a different shape of glass." I nodded slowly. "We spent 5,000 years polishing our lens," he said. "We became very good at it. We became so good that we stopped remembering it was a lens at all. We began to believe it was simply the way of seeing." He looked back at the screen. Then he looked at my mother across the room. "Deputy Attaché Ellison," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I owe you and your species an apology. I have said, in writings that have been repeated across this galaxy for centuries, that wisdom means knowing which walls cannot be moved. I said this because I genuinely believed it, and I was wrong." A pause. "A wall that has stood for 5,000 years is not proof that the wall cannot fall. It is proof only that no one standing before it ever happened to be carrying the right kind of tool." My mother pressed her lips together very hard. Wuhan looked back down at me. "What is your name?" "Kara Ellison." "Kara Ellison," he repeated. "Earth has been asking for a place in the Galactic Assembly for 11 years. The Council has been deliberating on whether humanity is ready. We have been measuring readiness in terms of age, of accumulated knowledge, of centuries of spacefaring experience." He paused. "I no longer think those are the right measurements." He called the council together right there, in the observatory, which had never been done in the history of the station. The vote was not close. Earth got its seat that morning. Not in 3,000 years, when we might have caught up to Velthari timelines. Not after decades of further evaluation. That morning, while the station's lights were still dimmed for night cycle, while I was still sitting on the floor in yesterday's clothes with protein bar crumbs on my shirt. My mother held herself together until we were in the corridor outside the observatory, and then she sat down on a bench and put her head in her hands, and I sat next to her and put my arm around her, and for a little while neither of us said anything. "I cannot believe you," she said finally, which was not really a sentence, but I understood what she meant. "I was bored," I said, "and the problem had a really elegant shape." She laughed. It came out strange and watery, but it was real. Kuavel found us there a few minutes later. He stood in front of me with all 4 visual organs directed at a point just past my shoulder, which I had learned meant a Velthari was working up to something they found uncomfortable to say. "I wish to formally apologize," he said. "In our first conversation, when you asked me questions about the tesserine collapse, I answered you as though you were unlikely to understand. I was condescending. I am aware of it now in a way that is deeply unpleasant. You were not the worst about it," I said honestly. "That is not the reassurance you think it is." I smiled. "No, I know. I accept the apology." He made that percussive sound again. Then, very carefully, he reached into the carrying pouch at his side and produced a small crystal tile covered in Velthari script. He held it out to me. "This is a formal record of first contact contribution. It will be placed in the Grand Archive. Your name will be written there in the permanent record of those who changed the course of this civilization." He paused. "You are the first human. You are the youngest being of any species whose name appears in the contribution archive. You are the only individual in the archive's history who solved a problem they encountered by accident while eating a snack." I took the tile. It was warm in my hand. "I am going to need you to explain how topology works," he said. "All of it, from the beginning. I suspect we have been missing a great deal. That will take a while. I have approximately 800 years left in my expected lifespan. I believe I can spare some of them. What happened after that is a matter of galactic historical record. Gate construction began within the year using the new framework. The first full-scale stable gate was completed 11 months later. It connected the Velthari home station to their nearest colony world, a journey that had previously taken 3 months by the fastest ship, and the first transit took 4 seconds. There were ceremonies, there were speeches, there were documentaries made across a dozen civilizations. I was not at the opening ceremony. I was back home in London by then, in my last year of school, sitting in Mrs. Albright's class working through a dimensional mapping problem and trying to remember where I had put my notebook from the year before. My mother kept the crystal tile in a case on the mantelpiece in our flat. Visitors would ask about it sometimes. She would tell them the story. Inevitably, they would look at me with a complicated expression that contained surprise and something close to disbelief, and I never quite knew what to do with that look, so I usually just offered them a biscuit and changed the subject. The honest truth is that I did not feel like someone who had changed the course of galactic history. I felt like someone who had been bored in the right place at the right time and happened to know a particular kind of mathematics that no one in the room had thought to bring. The Velthari had spent 5,000 years looking at an impossible problem. They had brought everything they had to it: brilliance, dedication, centuries of accumulated wisdom, the full weight of their civilization's intellectual tradition. What they had not brought was someone who did not know the problem was supposed to be impossible. Nobody told me the boundary of the unsolvable was unsolvable. They told each other that. In a closed room, across 5,000 years, passing the certainty down from teacher to student to student to teacher, until it had become something harder than fact, something that did not need to be tested anymore because everyone already knew. I was not standing in that room. I was standing in a doorway eating a protein bar, looking at an equation that had a very interesting shape, and thinking that I recognized it from something I had once drawn in a notebook when I was 15. So I sat down and I wrote. That is what we do, I think. Maybe that is the thing about humans that no one quite expected. We are young, we are inexperienced. We do not have 4 brains or 1,000-year lifespans, or the weight of accumulated millennia behind every thought. We walk into rooms full of ancient certainties and we do not know we are supposed to be intimidated by them. We just see the problem. And we try.